The building is sleeping, or at least pretending to. Outside, winter presses softly against the stone walls. Snow gathers along window ledges and settles upon roofs already burdened by weeks of cold. The darkness carries little movement now. No engines. No church bells. No distant voices drifting through village streets. Only wind moving carefully through the trees beyond the town, brushing branches together like fingers turning pages in a forgotten book. Inside, beneath blankets and coats gathered from every available corner, dozens of wounded men breathe unevenly in the dark. Some sleep. Some drift between sleep and pain. Some stare toward ceilings they cannot properly see. The room smells faintly of damp wool, antiseptic, candle smoke, and melting snow carried indoors on boots hours earlier. A nurse moves between the beds. She carries no lantern at first. The moonlight filtering through frosted glass provides enough illumination for familiar pathways. She knows where the floorboards creak. She knows which patients are likely to wake calling for water and which are likely to wake believing themselves still on some battlefield beyond the forests surrounding Bastogne. Her footsteps remain slow and measured. Not because there is time to spare. Because haste has become impossible. The war has narrowed itself into smaller things here. A blanket adjusted carefully over a fevered shoulder. A spoonful of water offered to dry lips. A pulse checked beneath cold fingers. The great movements of armies still exist somewhere beyond the darkness, but inside these rooms the conflict has been reduced to quieter calculations. Who can wait? Who cannot? Who might improve before morning? Who may not see morning at all? You watch the nurse pause beside a bed near the far wall. The patient appears asleep. His bandages disappear beneath layers of blankets. Frost has formed in delicate patterns along the window behind him, spreading across the glass like pale rivers. For a moment she simply stands there listening, not to the man himself, but to the rhythm of the room. The breathing. The shifting. The occasional groan emerging from dreams no medicine can reach. Beyond the building, snow continues falling. It lands upon roads crowded with vehicles that can no longer move easily. It settles across artillery positions hidden among trees. It gathers atop foxholes, fence posts, abandoned carts, and fields where winter has erased the boundaries between one farm and the next. The countryside surrounding Bastogne seems almost peaceful beneath its white covering. Yet beneath that silence, thousands of lives are slowly tightening into a siege. The people inside this building do not yet know precisely how severe that siege will become. News arrives unevenly. Rumors travel faster than certainty. Maps change from day to day. Roads open and close. Units appear and disappear. Every new ambulance seems to carry a different version of events. Still, certain realities have already become impossible to ignore. The wounded continue arriving. The weather continues worsening. The distances between safety and danger continue shrinking. For the nurses working within Bastogne's hospitals and aid stations, the war is beginning to gather weight. Not suddenly, like an explosion. Not dramatically, like a charge across open ground. Instead it arrives gradually, accumulating one patient at a time, one missing shipment at a time, one interrupted night of sleep at a time. The burden settles quietly, like snow. And just as snow can transform an entire landscape while appearing to change almost nothing at all, the coming weeks will transform these hospitals into something very different from what they were before the German offensive began. For now, though, the nurse continues her rounds. The corridor beyond remains dim. Somewhere downstairs a door opens briefly, allowing a gust of frozen air to enter before closing again. Voices murmur. Footsteps cross stone floors. Another vehicle may have arrived. Or perhaps another has left. In Bastogne during the winter of 1944, certainty is becoming a luxury. The work continues regardless. The beds remain occupied. The night remains long. And outside, beneath the falling snow, an entire battlefield is slowly moving closer. If you find yourself enjoying this journey through the quieter corners of history, consider subscribing to the channel. These stories allow us to linger where history often moves too quickly, among the ordinary people whose experiences rarely fit neatly onto maps or timelines. And now, settle comfortably as the snow continues falling beyond the windows of Bastogne. You're listening to Echoes of War. By the time dawn begins to gather behind the clouds, the snow has softened the edges of nearly everything. Fences appear lower. Roads appear narrower. Farmhouses seem partially absorbed into the landscape itself. The forests surrounding Bastogne stand motionless beneath their white covering, each branch carrying a little more weight than it did the day before. Across the Ardennes, winter is performing its patient work, reshaping the world one snowfall at a time. Inside the hospitals, however, there is no stillness. The first light of morning reveals rooms already awake. Nurses move between rows of beds carrying basins of water. Surgeons review notes written during the night. Orderlies carry supplies through crowded corridors. The wounded stir beneath blankets as another day begins. Many of the men arrived only recently. Others have been here for days. Some will recover quickly. Others face journeys measured not in weeks but in months. Their uniforms carry traces of forests, roads, trenches, and villages scattered across Belgium and Luxembourg. Mud remains trapped in seams. Snowmelt stains blankets. The battlefield follows them indoors, arriving in fragments upon boots, coats, bandages, and exhausted faces. The nurses encounter these fragments constantly. A wound tells one story. A pair of frozen hands tells another. A soldier who has not slept properly for a week reveals yet another version of the war unfolding beyond the hospital walls. No single patient contains the entire picture. Yet together they create something larger. A mosaic assembled from pain, endurance, confusion, and survival. As the German offensive continues to expand across the Ardennes, Bastogne finds itself becoming increasingly important. Roads converge here. Units pass through here. Supplies move through here. Messages arrive and depart through here. The town sits at the center of a network that suddenly matters far more than many expected. That growing importance carries consequences. The wounded arrive more frequently. Medical staff remain on duty longer. The distinction between temporary emergency and daily reality begins to blur. Yet this story is not primarily about generals, maps, or battlefield maneuvers. Those events remain present, shaping every decision made inside the hospitals. But they exist mostly beyond the walls, like distant weather influencing the course of a river. This story belongs to the people who remained indoors while the siege gathered around them. The nurses who worked beneath dim lights while artillery echoed across frozen fields. The surgeons who continued operating despite shortages, fatigue, and uncertainty. The patients who waited through long nights wondering whether evacuation would come tomorrow, next week, or not at all. Together they inhabited a world suspended between war and recovery. A fragile world. A crowded world. A world where every blanket, every bottle of plasma, every hour of sleep carried measurable value. Over the next several hours, we will move quietly through that world. We will follow the hospitals and aid stations of Bastogne as they change beneath growing pressure. We will watch routines adapt, resources diminish, and endurance deepen. We will return again and again to the same corridors, wards, treatment rooms, and recovery spaces, observing how they evolve as winter, isolation, and war reshape them. The rooms that still function. At first, the hospitals of Bastogne continue behaving like hospitals. That may sound obvious, yet in wartime it is never guaranteed. Buildings designed for healing often become something else when conflict approaches. They become evacuation centers, shelters, headquarters, storage depots, or ruins. Their original purpose can disappear beneath military necessity. During the early days of December 1944, however, many of Bastogne's medical facilities still retain a sense of normal function. The routines established over previous months continue operating with only minor adjustments. Patients arrive. Patients are treated. Patients recover or move elsewhere. The machinery of military medicine turns steadily. In one ward, a nurse records temperatures and pulse rates while morning light filters through tall windows. Nearby, another prepares dressings for a fresh group of arrivals expected later that afternoon. A surgeon reviews case notes over a cup of coffee that has long since cooled. Conversations remain practical. Schedules remain recognizable. Supplies still exist in sufficient quantities to support ordinary procedures. The atmosphere feels strained at times, but not yet transformed. Outside, military traffic has increased noticeably. Trucks move along roads that were quieter only weeks earlier. Columns of soldiers pass through nearby villages. Staff members hear fragments of information carried in by drivers, patients, and visiting officers. Reports suggest heavy fighting in some areas. Other reports contradict them. Rumor competes constantly with fact. Yet uncertainty is not unusual during wartime. Medical workers have learned to live alongside incomplete information. The wounded provide their own version of events. A young infantryman arriving from the front may describe German armor advancing through forests. Another patient transported from a different sector insists the situation remains under control. Someone else reports seeing roads crowded with retreating units. Hours later, another witness claims the opposite. The nurses absorb these stories while changing bandages, distributing meals, and helping patients sit upright in bed. Rarely do they have time to evaluate whether the stories are accurate. The next task is already waiting. You watch one nurse move through a recovery ward shortly before noon. The room contains perhaps 24 patients. Some write letters. Some sleep. Others stare through windows at the snowy landscape beyond. A radio murmurs somewhere near the far wall. Its signal fades in and out, swallowed occasionally by static. The nurse pauses beside each bed with quiet efficiency. She straightens blankets, checks dressings, answers questions, offers reassurance when she can. Unlike the soldiers under her care, she is not moving through forests or crossing battlefields. Yet her understanding of the war emerges gradually through hundreds of brief interactions. Each patient contributes a small piece of information. Each conversation adds another fragment to a larger picture. The picture remains incomplete, but it is growing. As the days pass, admissions begin increasing. Not dramatically at first. A few additional ambulances. Several more stretchers. A handful of extra beds placed wherever space allows. The changes seem manageable because they arrive incrementally. Hospitals are accustomed to fluctuations. Medical personnel adapt naturally. Corridors become slightly more crowded. Meal schedules require minor adjustments. Storage rooms empty a little faster than before. Nothing yet suggests how far these adjustments will eventually go. Winter itself creates additional work. Cold weather affects every aspect of hospital life. Water freezes where it should not. Vehicles struggle on icy roads. Heating systems require constant attention. Blankets become precious. Dry clothing becomes valuable. Even transporting patients between buildings grows more complicated when snow and ice transform simple tasks into exhausting ones. The nurses understand these realities well. Many have already spent months working through difficult conditions. They know how quickly cold can weaken a patient. They know how rapidly exhaustion can accumulate when nights lengthen and temperatures fall. They know that winter often becomes an adversary of its own, operating independently of whichever army happens to be nearby. For now, however, winter remains a complication rather than a crisis. The wards remain warm enough. The kitchens continue functioning. The supply rooms remain stocked. The roads remain open. Most importantly, patients can still be moved elsewhere when necessary. This final assumption quietly supports everything. Medical planning depends upon movement. Hospitals expect difficult cases to be transferred. Supplies are expected to arrive. Personnel are expected to rotate. Ambulances are expected to travel. The entire system rests upon the belief that roads will continue connecting one place to another. During these early days, few people inside Bastogne's hospitals fully appreciate how fragile that assumption is becoming. The medical system continues operating as though the larger network around it will remain intact. For a little while longer, that belief still feels reasonable. The corridors remain busy. The treatment rooms remain functional. The nurses continue moving from patient to patient. And beyond the windows, snow continues falling across roads that are slowly becoming more important than anyone yet realizes. During the afternoons, a particular rhythm settles over the hospitals. The urgency of morning admissions begins to ease. Surgeries already underway continue behind closed doors. Meals have been distributed. Temperatures have been recorded. Beds have been adjusted. For a few hours the institution enters a quieter state, not because there is less work, but because the work has become familiar again. Nurses learn to recognize these intervals. A ward filled with wounded men possesses its own soundscape. Metal bed frames shift slightly as patients change position. Distant footsteps echo through corridors. Water pours into basins. Pages turn. Someone coughs. Someone else snores softly despite pain medication that never quite delivers complete relief. Beneath these individual sounds exists a collective atmosphere of waiting. Waiting for recovery. Waiting for transport. Waiting for letters. Waiting for news. The war beyond the walls appears only in fragments. A soldier may describe a village whose name nobody in the ward recognizes. Another speaks about artillery firing somewhere beyond the forests. A driver arriving with supplies reports crowded roads and worsening weather. These stories circulate briefly before dissolving into the larger routine of treatment and care. The nurses hear everything. Yet they have learned not to become attached to every report. Too many stories arrive incomplete. Too many details change within hours. Experience teaches caution. A rumor may feel important in the morning and irrelevant by evening. Certainty remains rare. Instead, attention focuses upon immediate realities. A dressing needs changing. A fever requires monitoring. A patient who refused food yesterday finally manages several spoonfuls of soup. These small developments carry genuine significance because they exist within reach. Unlike military maps and battlefield reports, they can be observed directly. You watch a nurse sit briefly beside a patient whose leg has been heavily bandaged. He is young enough to appear almost out of place among the older men surrounding him. Outside the window, snow drifts across a courtyard. Inside, the patient speaks quietly about home. Not dramatically, not emotionally, simply describing ordinary details. A kitchen table, a family dog, a road leading past neighboring farms. The nurse listens while continuing her work. Such conversations occur constantly. The wounded often travel backward through memory. Their bodies remain in Belgium, but their thoughts wander elsewhere. Toward homes in Texas, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York. Toward cities and farms separated from Bastogne by an ocean and by circumstances neither they nor their families could have imagined only a few years earlier. For nurses, these moments occupy an unusual space between medicine and companionship. No manual can fully explain their value. The conversation itself changes nothing measurable. It does not close wounds or lower fevers. Yet it helps maintain a connection to a world beyond pain, beyond uniforms, beyond the cold routines of treatment. In hospitals everywhere, recovery depends partly upon such connections. As daylight fades, shadows lengthen across the wards. Winter afternoons disappear quickly in the Ardennes. By late afternoon, lamps must be lit. Curtains are drawn against the cold. Evening rounds begin. The nurses continue moving. Their work remains physical in countless small ways. Lifting patients, carrying supplies, standing for hours, climbing stairs, walking corridors so often that distances become instinctive rather than conscious. Fatigue accumulates gradually, hidden beneath routine. Most do not discuss it openly. There is little reason to. Everyone is tired. Everyone continues working. The hospitals still function because thousands of ordinary tasks continue occurring regardless of weather, news, or uncertainty. The institution survives through repetition. One completed task leads naturally to the next. Bandages are changed because bandages always need changing. Meals are served because patients must eat. Floors are cleaned because cleanliness remains necessary even during war. This continuity creates a sense of stability, perhaps even an illusion of stability. The medical personnel understand that fighting is occurring nearby, yet daily routine still suggests a future that resembles the recent past. Tomorrow's schedule appears recognizable. Supplies are expected. Transfers remain possible. Additional staff may arrive if required. The assumptions underlying military medicine remain largely intact. Meanwhile, beyond Bastogne, events are already beginning to challenge those assumptions. German formations move through forests and valleys concealed by weather and terrain. Roads become crowded with vehicles moving in unexpected directions. Communication grows more complicated. Distances that appeared manageable on maps begin behaving differently under winter conditions and battlefield pressure. The hospitals do not experience these changes immediately. Instead, they encounter them indirectly. A delay here. An unexpected arrival there. A shipment that arrives later than anticipated. An ambulance route that suddenly becomes less reliable. Each development appears manageable in isolation. None seem sufficient to transform the system by themselves. Yet systems rarely change all at once. More often they shift through accumulation. One missing element joins another. One disruption overlaps with the next. Gradually, almost invisibly, familiar routines begin carrying additional strain. As evening deepens, Snow continues falling outside the windows. The wards glow softly beneath artificial light. Nurses complete their final rounds before night duty takes over. Patients settle beneath blankets. Conversations fade. For a few hours, the hospitals still resemble what they have been for months. Functional. Predictable. Connected to the wider network supporting them. The people inside cannot yet see how quickly those connections are narrowing. But the roads are changing. The flow of information is changing. The movement upon which the entire medical system depends is changing. And soon, the hospitals of Bastogne will discover what happens when a system designed for circulation finds itself trapped within a siege. Roads beneath the snow. The first signs do not arrive dramatically. There is no single announcement delivered to every ward. No officer steps into the hospitals carrying a document that explains precisely how conditions are changing. The transformation begins instead through scattered observations collected by people whose attention is already occupied elsewhere. An ambulance arrives later than expected. A driver mentions unusual traffic on a road that had been clear only days earlier. A shipment appears incomplete. Telephone calls become harder to place. Small things. The sort of things that happen regularly during wartime. Yet the nurses begin noticing them because nurses are professional observers. Much of their work depends upon detecting changes before those changes become obvious to everyone else. They monitor temperatures before fevers become dangerous. They recognize exhaustion before collapse occurs. They identify complications while they are still manageable. The same habits shape how they perceive the world beyond the wards. Something feels different. Not alarming. Not yet. Simply different. Outside Bastogne, the Ardennes remains a landscape of forests, narrow roads, villages, and winter fields. Snow continues covering the countryside. The weather reduces visibility and slows movement. Convoys advance cautiously. Vehicles struggle on icy surfaces. Drivers spend long hours peering through windshields clouded by breath and frost. The roads carry everything. Soldiers. Fuel. Food. Ammunition. Medical supplies. The wounded. Without roads, the entire system begins losing its shape. Inside one hospital, a nurse helping unload newly arrived casualties notices that the drivers appear unusually tense. They speak less than normal. Their expressions suggest long hours behind the wheel and difficult journeys through uncertain conditions. Nothing they say sounds particularly alarming. Yet their silence communicates something of its own. The roads are becoming harder. The weather explains part of this. The offensive explains the rest. At first, however, the two influences remain difficult to separate. Winter creates delays. War creates delays. Snow closes routes. Combat closes routes. A vehicle arriving late could be responding to either cause or both simultaneously. The hospitals continue functioning despite the ambiguity. Patients still arrive. Operations still proceed. Meals still appear. The routines established during previous weeks remain intact. But they now require greater effort to maintain. You watch an orderly push a cart through a corridor lined with extra stretchers. The cart carries supplies that would normally be stored elsewhere. Storage spaces are already beginning to feel more crowded. Administrators are reluctant to discuss shortages because shortages have not yet fully materialized. Yet people are becoming increasingly conscious of inventories. How much plasma remains? How many dressings? How much fuel? How many blankets? The questions emerge quietly. Not because resources are gone. Because people have begun wondering what happens if replacements stop arriving. This shift in thinking marks an important threshold. A functioning supply system encourages confidence. Staff members use what is needed because they trust additional shipments will follow. Once uncertainty enters the equation, every item acquires a slightly different meaning. A blanket becomes not only a blanket. It becomes a resource. A bottle of medicine becomes not only medicine. It becomes a quantity that can diminish. The change is subtle but significant. The hospitals are beginning to think defensively. Patients notice some of these changes as well. Not through official announcements but through atmosphere. Human beings are remarkably sensitive to variations in routine. A delayed meal. A hurried conversation between staff members. A hallway temporarily crowded with unfamiliar personnel. Such details accumulate beneath conscious awareness. The wounded watch. They listen. They speculate. Many possess more information than the medical staff realize. Fresh arrivals carry recent battlefield experiences. Drivers report conditions encountered on the roads. Officers discuss movements and deployments while believing others are not paying attention. Everyone assembles their own version of events. No version is entirely complete. Yet a shared impression slowly emerges. The situation is becoming more complicated. As daylight fades one afternoon, fresh snow begins falling again. Through hospital windows, the world appears increasingly monochrome. White fields, grey skies, dark forests standing motionless beyond the town. The landscape looks peaceful. The roads hidden beneath that snow tell a different story. Somewhere beyond Bastogne, vehicles are turning back from routes they expected to use. Somewhere else, columns are moving toward destinations that seemed unlikely only days earlier. Elsewhere still, wounded men are waiting for transport that may take longer than anticipated. The hospitals cannot yet see these developments directly. They experience only the consequences arriving at their doors. Another delayed ambulance. Another uncertain report. Another shipment that seems slightly smaller than expected. Each observation remains manageable. Taken together, they suggest a system beginning to tighten. The nurses continue their rounds. The surgeons continue operating. The patients continue waiting. Yet beneath the routines that still define daily life, an uncomfortable realization is slowly forming. The roads connecting Bastogne to the wider world are no longer behaving as they should. And the hospitals built upon those connections are about to discover how dependent they truly are upon movement. As the days pass, the hospitals begin developing a new relationship with uncertainty. Previously, uncertainty had existed mostly beyond the walls. It belonged to soldiers moving through forests, commanders studying maps, and drivers navigating difficult roads. Inside the wards, daily life remained structured by procedures. Patients were admitted. Patients were treated. Supplies arrived. Records were maintained. The institution functioned according to expectations established through repetition. Now uncertainty begins entering the building itself. Not all at once. It arrives in fragments. A vehicle expected in the morning reaches Bastogne after sunset. A transfer is postponed without a clear explanation. A shipment arrives missing items that had been requested. The disruptions remain small enough that each one can be explained individually. Yet their frequency is increasing. The nurses notice because routine provides a reference point. Any system built upon repetition becomes sensitive to deviation. The more familiar the pattern, the easier it becomes to recognize when the pattern changes. In treatment rooms, conversations begin reflecting this new awareness. Staff members compare observations. One nurse mentions difficulties obtaining fresh linens. Another notes that several patients scheduled for evacuation remain in place. A surgeon remarks that replacement supplies have taken longer than anticipated. None of these developments would be alarming on their own. Together, they create a sense of pressure gathering somewhere beyond sight. You watch a nurse standing beside a window during a brief pause between duties. Outside, evening approaches. Snow continues drifting across rooftops and streets. A military truck moves slowly through the town below, its tires struggling for traction on the icy surface. Several soldiers walk beside it, heads lowered against the cold. The scene appears ordinary. Yet movement itself is becoming increasingly important. Every vehicle entering Bastogne now represents a connection preserved. Every vehicle leaving represents a connection tested. The town remains linked to the outside world, but those links feel less permanent than before. Winter amplifies everything. Cold affects machines as relentlessly as it affects people. Engines become difficult to start. Fuel consumption rises. Roads deteriorate beneath repeated use. Drivers remain exposed to freezing temperatures for hours at a time. Mechanical failures that might be inconvenient during autumn become serious obstacles during December. The medical system experiences these effects indirectly. An ambulance delayed by weather arrives with patients who have endured additional hours of pain. A supply truck slowed by conditions reaches the hospitals later than planned. A driver exhausted by difficult roads becomes less capable of making another journey immediately. Each delay creates another delay. Each complication overlaps with others. The system still functions, but it now requires greater effort to produce the same results. Inside the wards, beds are filling steadily. Not rapidly enough to provoke panic. Not slowly enough to ignore. The increase is noticeable. Additional stretchers appear in corners and corridors. Rooms designed for one purpose begin serving another. Staff members become increasingly skilled at finding space where little space seems available. Hospitals have always possessed this talent. They expand and contract according to necessity. Yet expansion carries costs. Crowded wards generate more work. More patients require more observation. More observation demands more time. Time, like supplies, is becoming a resource that feels less abundant than before. The nurses adapt naturally because adaptation has become second nature. They rearrange schedules, adjust priorities, simplify procedures where possible. They rarely discuss these changes as innovations because the work itself encourages practicality rather than reflection. A task must be completed. Therefore, the task is completed. The philosophy appears simple. Its consequences are profound. As darkness settles across Bastogne one evening, a fresh convoy arrives carrying wounded men from fighting that seems closer than before. Mud and snow cover uniforms. Faces show exhaustion more than fear. Several patients fall asleep almost immediately after reaching shelter, their bodies surrendering to warmth and relative safety. The nurses move among them with practiced efficiency. Coats are removed. Bandages are checked. Records are updated. Questions are asked. Answers are recorded. The process remains familiar. Yet the volume is increasing. The hospital is beginning to absorb more pressure than it was designed to carry. Still, the staff continue believing that movement will eventually restore balance. Patients can be transferred. Supplies can arrive. Additional assistance can appear. The assumptions remain alive, though increasingly fragile. Beyond the town, however, the larger situation is evolving more quickly than many inside Bastogne realize. Roads that appear open on maps are becoming unreliable in practice. Routes once considered routine now involve risk. Distances measured in miles begin feeling much longer beneath combat conditions and winter weather. The hospitals encounter these developments only through symptoms. A missing shipment. A delayed ambulance. A growing number of wounded occupying beds that should already be empty. Like physicians diagnosing an illness before all evidence is available, they are beginning to recognize a pattern. The circulation upon which the entire medical system depends is slowing. Not stopped. Not yet. But slowing. And when circulation weakens, every part of the body eventually feels the consequences. The same principle applies to towns, to armies, and to hospitals standing beneath a winter sky while a siege quietly approaches. Outside, snow continues settling upon the roads leading into Bastogne. Inside, lamps glow warmly above crowded wards where nurses continue moving from bed to bed. The routines remain recognizable. The assumptions supporting those routines are beginning to change. Beyond the windows, the roads disappear beneath fresh snow, carrying fewer certainties with each passing day. Corridors growing narrower. There comes a moment in many institutions when pressure ceases to feel temporary. No announcement marks its arrival. No bell rings. No document records the exact hour. Instead, people simply begin behaving differently. The hospitals of Bastogne reach that threshold gradually as December advances. The changes remain subtle enough that few could identify when they first appeared, yet clear enough that everyone eventually recognizes them. The wards are fuller. The corridors are busier. The future feels less predictable. The hospitals still function. In many respects, they function remarkably well. Patients continue receiving treatment. Operations continue. Meals continue arriving. Records continue being maintained. If an outside observer were to spend only a few minutes inside one of the buildings, the institution might appear entirely stable. But those who live inside it notice the difference. The spaces between tasks are shrinking. You watch a nurse emerge from one ward carrying a stack of notes. Before she reaches the end of the corridor, someone requests assistance in another room. Halfway there, she is stopped by an orderly needing information about a patient transfer. Moments later, a surgeon asks about available beds. None of these requests are unusual. What has changed is their density. The day contains the same number of hours. The demands placed upon those hours do not. This growing compression affects everything. Meals become quicker. Conversations become shorter. Rest periods become easier to postpone. A task that might once have been completed leisurely is now completed efficiently. Another task immediately follows. The nurses adapt without complaint because adaptation is part of the profession. They have spent months, sometimes years, learning how to remain effective under changing conditions. Yet adaptation carries hidden costs. A person can function well while simultaneously becoming more tired, more strained, and more dependent upon routine. The hospitals are beginning to consume their reserves. Not supplies alone. People. Outside, winter continues tightening its grip upon the Ardennes. Snow remains along roadsides. Frost gathers each morning upon windows and rooftops. The forests surrounding Bastogne appear frozen in place beneath pale skies. The wounded arrive carrying pieces of that landscape with them. Cold-soaked uniforms. snow-covered boots. Faces reddened by wind and exposure. Many have spent long hours outdoors before reaching shelter. Some have traveled through difficult conditions after injury. Others arrive exhausted less from their wounds than from the journey required to reach treatment. The nurses observe these patterns repeatedly. The same cold appears again and again. The same fatigue. The same hunger. The same relief visible when a patient finally enters a heated room. Over time, the hospitals begin reflecting the siege conditions developing outside. Though protected by walls and roofs, they cannot fully separate themselves from the environment around them. Winter enters indirectly through every patient, every vehicle, every supply delay, every frozen road. The boundaries between inside and outside become thinner than they appear. One afternoon, a shipment arrives carrying fewer materials than expected. The difference is not catastrophic. No immediate crisis follows. Yet the response reveals how much attitudes have changed. Weeks earlier, such a discrepancy might have been dismissed as a clerical issue. Now inventories are checked twice. Questions are asked. Calculations are made. Staff members begin considering alternatives. The missing supplies matter not because they are urgently needed today, but because nobody feels certain about tomorrow. Scarcity often begins this way. Not with absence. With anticipation. You watch a nurse opening a cabinet containing medical dressings. The shelves are not empty. Far from it. Yet her attention lingers on quantities rather than mere availability. She notices how much remains. She notices how quickly items are being used. She notices how many patients still require care. The mental arithmetic becomes automatic. A hospital under pressure starts counting. Beds. Bandages. Medicines. Hours. The counting itself changes the atmosphere. Without realizing it, people begin viewing familiar objects through a different lens. Resources cease being background assumptions and become visible elements of daily life. This transformation extends beyond supplies. Space is counted. Time is counted. Energy is counted. A nurse approaching the end of a shift begins calculating whether she can remain another hour. A surgeon finishing one operation estimates how many more procedures might follow. Administrators examine rooms not for their intended purpose but for their capacity. How many additional beds? How many additional patients? How much additional strain? The questions accumulate quietly. The hospitals remain functional. Yet functionality now requires constant adjustment. Outside the windows, snow drifts across the town once more. The landscape appears calm, almost timeless beneath its winter covering. Trees stand motionless. Rooftops glow faintly beneath overcast skies. Smoke rises from chimneys and disappears into cold air. Inside, however, time feels different. Faster. Denser. More crowded. The routines established during earlier weeks still exist, but they now operate under increasing pressure. And pressure, even when invisible, changes the shape of everything it touches. As the pressure increases, the hospitals begin developing habits that would have seemed unnecessary only weeks earlier. Nothing formal announces these adaptations. There are no grand reforms, no sweeping changes imposed from above. Instead, adjustments emerge organically from daily experience. Staff members discover ways to conserve effort. They learn which procedures can be simplified without compromising care. They identify small efficiencies that save minutes here and there, and gradually those minutes become valuable. A nurse entering a ward already knows which patients are likely to require immediate attention and which can safely wait a little longer. An orderly learns the fastest route between crowded rooms. Surgeons become increasingly selective about how they allocate their time and energy. The institution begins streamlining itself. This process is not dramatic. In fact, it often appears invisible to outsiders. Yet it reveals an important truth about organizations under pressure. They do not merely endure changing conditions. They reorganize themselves around those conditions. The hospitals of Bastogne are beginning to do exactly that. You watch one evening unfold across several wards simultaneously. Lamps cast warm pools of light across rows of beds. Nurses move steadily through the rooms carrying trays, records, and supplies. Conversations occur in low voices. Outside, darkness settles over the town long before many people feel ready for night. Winter shortens the days. The workload ignores the calendar. Patients continue arriving regardless of sunset. A new group enters shortly after dusk, carried through corridors already crowded with stretchers and equipment. Their arrival creates no sense of alarm because such arrivals have become expected. Yet each new patient requires attention, and attention is becoming one of the most heavily demanded resources within the hospital. The nurses absorb this demand almost instinctively. Their movements grow more economical. Less wasted motion. Less hesitation. The work acquires a quiet precision born from repetition. Observers sometimes imagine wartime hospitals as places defined by constant emergency, but long periods of endurance often shape them more profoundly. The dramatic moments matter, certainly. Yet institutions are usually transformed by accumulation rather than spectacle. One difficult day can be endured. 10 difficult days begin altering behavior. 20 difficult days begin altering expectations. The hospitals are moving into that second category. What once felt temporary now feels increasingly normal. A patient recovering near a window notices this shift from a different perspective. He has been inside long enough to observe patterns. He recognizes familiar nurses. He notices changes in schedules. He sees beds that once stood empty becoming occupied. He watches staff members carrying themselves with slightly greater urgency than before. Recovery grants him time to observe. Observation reveals transformation. The same is true throughout the building. Everyone is witnessing change from a different angle. The surgeons experience it through workload. The administrators through logistics. The orderlies through movement. The nurses through sustained human contact. Among all these perspectives, the nurses possess a particularly unique view because they remain connected to nearly every aspect of hospital life. They encounter the wounded when they arrive. They observe recovery when it occurs. They witness deterioration when it cannot be prevented. They move between treatment rooms, storage areas, kitchens, offices, and wards. The entire institution passes before them in fragments. Those fragments are beginning to form a coherent picture. The hospitals are carrying more weight than before, and the weight continues increasing. Outside Bastogne, the military situation grows more complicated. News reaches the hospitals unevenly, filtered through rumor, official reports, and conversations overheard in hallways. Nobody possesses a complete understanding of events. Few expect to. Yet one fact becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Movement is becoming harder. Patients who might previously have been transferred elsewhere remain where they are. Supplies arrive less predictably. Drivers speak about roads in ways that suggest caution rather than confidence. The implications ripple through every level of hospital planning. A patient occupying a bed longer than expected affects room availability. Reduced room availability influences admissions. Admissions influence staffing. Staffing influences fatigue. Everything connects. The nurses understand this intuitively, even when the larger logistics remain invisible. Hospitals function as ecosystems. Pressure in one area eventually appears somewhere else. Tonight, that pressure appears in the faces of staff members finishing shifts that seem longer than the clock suggests. It appears in storage rooms that feel slightly smaller. It appears in corridors where extra stretchers occupy spaces never intended for them. Yet despite these changes, the hospitals remain remarkably calm. This calm should not be mistaken for comfort. Rather, it reflects discipline. People continue performing their duties because the alternative serves no one. The wounded still require care. The next patient still needs treatment. The next night still arrives. You watch a nurse pause briefly at the end of a corridor. For a moment she leans against the wall, reviewing notes beneath the glow of a lamp. The pause lasts only seconds. Soon another task calls her elsewhere. The brief stillness disappears. The work resumes. Around her, the institution continues adapting to conditions that seem unlikely to improve soon. The hospitals remain functional. The routines remain recognizable. But the margins that once protected those routines are steadily disappearing. And as winter deepens around Bastogne, the people inside are beginning to understand that they may need to function for a long time without the certainty of relief. The corridor grows quiet for a moment, though beyond its walls the pressure continues gathering like snow upon a roof. The arithmetic of scarcity. By late December, the hospitals of Bastogne begin thinking differently. The transformation is subtle enough that nobody announces it, yet profound enough that it touches nearly every decision made within the buildings. The medical staff still focus upon healing. They still devote themselves to the welfare of their patients. Their purpose has not changed. What has changed is the context surrounding that purpose. For weeks, the hospitals have functioned within a system built upon expectation. Supplies would arrive. Patients would be transferred. Equipment would be replaced. Assistance would eventually appear if conditions became difficult. Now those expectations are weakening. Not disappearing entirely. Weakening. The distinction matters because institutions rarely collapse the moment resources become uncertain. Instead, they begin conserving. They begin calculating. They begin examining every process through the lens of endurance. The hospitals of Bastogne are entering that phase. You watch a nurse prepare supplies for the coming shift. The task itself appears ordinary. Dressings are organized. Instruments are checked. Medicines are accounted for. Similar preparations have occurred countless times before. Yet her attention now lingers on quantities. How many remain? How quickly they are being used? How long they might last? The calculations occur silently. No one needs to instruct her to think this way. The environment itself encourages it. Scarcity often begins long before shelves become empty. It begins when people stop assuming replenishment. Across the hospitals, similar mental arithmetic is unfolding. Surgeons consider which procedures require immediate action and which can safely wait. Administrators review inventories more frequently than before. Orderlies learn to recover and reuse materials whenever practical. Every resource acquires additional significance. Bandages, plasma, fuel, candles, blankets. even hot water. Winter magnifies the importance of everything. In warmer seasons, discomfort can sometimes be tolerated. During an Ardennes winter, discomfort can become danger. A poorly heated room affects recovery. Wet clothing creates additional medical problems. A shortage of blankets influences more than comfort. The cold infiltrates every calculation. The nurses see its effects constantly. Patients arrive shivering despite layers of clothing. Fingers remain stiff. Faces appear pale with exhaustion and exposure. Some men suffer injuries complicated by days spent outdoors before reaching treatment. Others carry the consequences of inadequate sleep, inadequate shelter, and prolonged contact with freezing temperatures. The hospitals provide refuge from those conditions. Yet refuge itself requires resources. The buildings must be heated. The patients must be fed. The lights must remain burning. Every act of care depends upon systems that are increasingly difficult to sustain. You watch evening settle across one of the wards. Lamps glow softly against gathering darkness. Snow presses against the windows. Patients lie beneath blankets while nurses move quietly between beds. The scene appears calm. The calm conceals a growing awareness. People have begun looking ahead. Not weeks ahead. Days ahead. Sometimes hours. A shipment delayed earlier might arrive tomorrow. Or it might not. A road reported open this morning might remain usable. Or it might not. The uncertainty reshapes planning. In ordinary circumstances, hospitals prepare for expected conditions. Here, preparation increasingly involves imagining interruptions. What happens if fuel becomes difficult to obtain? What happens if additional casualties arrive? What happens if evacuation remains impossible? Questions multiply faster than answers. Yet the nurses continue working within the reality immediately before them. Addressing change properly today remains valuable regardless of tomorrow's uncertainty. A patient comforted tonight still benefits from comfort. A fever reduced matters. A wound cleaned matters. The immediate responsibilities remain unchanged even as the larger environment grows more complicated. This dual awareness becomes one of the defining characteristics of life inside the siege. Two realities coexist. The first is immediate and practical. The next patient. The next procedure. The next shift. The second is broader and less predictable. The siege. The weather. The roads. The supplies. The future. The nurses move constantly between these realities. Their hands remain occupied with present tasks while their thoughts increasingly account for future constraints. Outside Bastogne, military events continue unfolding across forests and frozen fields. Maps change. Positions shift. Commanders make decisions that will influence thousands of lives. Inside the hospitals, however, the siege is experienced differently. Not as arrows moving across maps. Not as battlefield reports. But as arithmetic. The arithmetic of remaining resources. The arithmetic of available space. The arithmetic of endurance. And like all forms of arithmetic, it demands careful attention because mistakes become more costly as margins grow smaller. The hospitals still function. The shelves still contain supplies. The wards still provide care. Yet the staff are beginning to understand that abundance is no longer the defining condition. Preservation is. And preservation changes the way people look at every object they touch. As scarcity becomes more visible, the hospitals develop a new kind of discipline. Earlier in the siege, Adaptation had largely involved managing increased workload. More patients, more movement, more pressure upon existing routines. The challenge had been expansion. Now the challenge becomes preservation. The distinction is important. Expansion asks how much additional work can be absorbed. Preservation asks how long the work can continue. The questions produce different habits. You watch a nurse extinguish a lamp in an unused room before leaving for another ward. The act takes only a moment. Under ordinary circumstances, it might not even register as noteworthy. Yet across Bastogne, hundreds of similarly small decisions are beginning to accumulate. Fuel saved here. A supply conserved there. An unnecessary task postponed. A resource protected. No individual action transforms the situation. Together they create resilience. The hospitals are learning how to endure uncertainty rather than merely respond to it. Winter remains an active participant in this process. Cold weather possesses a remarkable ability to reveal dependency. People discover what they rely upon only after access becomes difficult. Heat, light, transportation, dry clothing, clean water. Many necessities pass unnoticed until circumstances threaten them. Inside the hospitals, awareness of these dependencies grows sharper each day. The heating systems receive constant attention. Windows are checked for drafts. Blankets circulate carefully between patients according to need. Every effort is made to create pockets of warmth within an environment determined to remove it. The nurses witness the consequences whenever warmth becomes difficult to maintain. Recovery slows. Discomfort increases. Sleep becomes more elusive. The human body spends precious energy resisting the cold rather than healing. These observations reinforce the importance of conservation. Resources are no longer viewed solely through logistical terms. They are measured against human outcomes. A blanket is warmth. Warmth is rest. Rest is recovery. The chain feels immediate and tangible. In one ward, a patient recovering from surgery asks whether supplies are running low. The question emerges casually, almost apologetically. Rumors travel quickly through hospitals. Patients notice conversations. They observe inventories. They draw conclusions from details that staff sometimes overlook. The nurse offers reassurance. The reassurance is genuine. The hospitals still possess resources. Yet the question itself reflects a growing awareness shared by everyone in the building. Scarcity is no longer theoretical. It has entered daily conversation. Not as panic. As context. You watch evening rounds continue beneath dim light. Nurses move between beds carrying clipboards and thermometers. Some patients sleep. Others remain awake, listening to distant sounds drifting through the night. Occasionally artillery can be heard far beyond the town, muted by distance and weather. The noise arrives as a reminder that the hospitals exist within a larger landscape of conflict. Yet the wards feel strangely insulated. Not separated from the war. Filtered from it. The violence arrives transformed into consequences rather than events. Wounds instead of battles. Exhaustion instead of maneuvers. Recovery instead of strategy. This perspective shapes how the nurses understand the siege. They experience military developments indirectly, through the people delivered into their care. Each patient becomes evidence. Evidence of weather. Evidence of combat. Evidence of conditions beyond the walls. Over time, patterns emerge. The journeys required to reach treatment seem longer. The fatigue appears deeper. The stories describe increasing difficulty. Individually, these observations reveal little. Together they suggest a world becoming more constrained. The hospitals mirror that process. Storage rooms that once seemed comfortably stocked now appear finite. Available beds seem fewer. Hours feel shorter. Everything acquires boundaries. And boundaries encourage prioritization. Not every task can be performed immediately. Not every request can be granted instantly. Choices become necessary. Most remain relatively small. Which patient should be seen first? Which room should receive additional heating? Which supplies should be reserved for future need? Yet the act of choosing marks an important transition. Abundance minimizes decision-making. Scarcity magnifies it. The nurses carry this burden quietly. Their profession has always involved judgment. The siege simply increases the frequency with which judgment must be exercised. Outside, snow continues accumulating across roads and fields. The landscape remains beautiful in a way that feels almost indifferent. Trees carry white burdens upon their branches. Farmhouses glow faintly against the darkness. The Ardennes appears serene beneath the winter sky. Inside the hospitals, serenity takes a different form. Not comfort. Not certainty. A disciplined calm maintained despite growing constraints. The nurses move steadily through their duties. They conserve what can be conserved. Protect what can be protected. Preserve what can be preserved. The arithmetic continues. Not because anyone wishes it to. Because circumstances demand it. And as the siege deepens, the calculations are becoming increasingly important to the survival of everyone within the hospital's care. Beyond the windows, winter measures the world in snow and silence. Inside, the hospitals begin measuring it in blankets, medicines, and time. Wards without empty beds. The hospitals do not become crowded overnight. Like so many changes during the siege, the transformation occurs through accumulation. One additional patient. Then another. A few more stretchers positioned along a wall. An unused room reassigned. A recovery space converted into something else. No individual adjustment appears remarkable. Yet together they gradually alter the character of the buildings. Space begins disappearing. Not entirely. Just enough to be noticed. You watch a nurse enter a ward she has crossed countless times before. The room itself remains unchanged. The same windows overlook the same winter landscape. The same lamps cast familiar pools of light across the floor. The same rows of beds occupy the same positions. What has changed is the distance between them. Additional beds have appeared. Additional stretchers. Additional patients. The room feels denser. Movement requires slightly more care than before. The change is subtle but unmistakable. Hospitals are designed around circulation. Patients, staff, equipment, and information must move continuously. Crowding does not merely affect comfort. It alters how the institution functions. The nurses experience this first through navigation. Routes become more complicated. A cart that once rolled easily through a corridor now requires adjustment. Equipment occupies spaces previously left clear. Conversations occur in closer proximity. Privacy becomes harder to maintain. The building remains functional. Yet every movement now involves a little more negotiation. The wounded notice it as well. A patient recovering near a doorway watches unfamiliar faces arrive throughout the day. Some remain briefly before transfer. Others settle into nearby beds. New voices join the atmosphere of the ward. New stories circulate. New reminders arrive that the conflict outside continues generating casualties faster than the hospitals can comfortably absorb them. The nurses learn names quickly. They must. Patients are arriving often enough that memory becomes a practical skill. Names, injuries, medications, concerns, family details mentioned during conversations. Each piece of information helps transform a crowded room into a collection of individuals rather than a collection of beds. This effort matters. Crowding has a tendency to reduce people into numbers. Medical staff work constantly against that tendency. You watch a nurse pause beside an elderly Belgian civilian sharing space with several American soldiers. Their circumstances differ. Their backgrounds differ. Yet the siege has brought them into the same room beneath the same roof. Such combinations become increasingly common. The hospitals of Bastogne serve many roles simultaneously. Military facility, civilian refuge, surgical center, recovery ward, shelter from winter, shelter from war. As pressure increases, these roles begin overlapping more visibly. The institution expands beyond its original boundaries. Not physically, functionally. One room acquires multiple purposes. One bed serves successive occupants. One nurse becomes responsible for more people than before. The adaptation remains impressive. It is also exhausting. Outside, winter continues imposing limits upon movement. Roads remain difficult. Transportation remains uncertain. Patients who might otherwise have left Bastogne remain where they are. Their continued presence influences everything. A bed occupied longer than expected cannot receive someone new. A patient awaiting evacuation requires food, warmth, observation, and care. The arithmetic of scarcity intersects with the reality of crowding. The effects reinforce one another. Inside one ward, the day begins before sunrise and ends long after darkness falls. Nurses move continuously between responsibilities. Temperatures are recorded. Dressings are changed. Meals are distributed. Questions answered. Reassurance is offered where possible. The tasks themselves remain familiar. What has changed is volume. More requests. More needs. More interruptions. The pace grows heavier without necessarily becoming faster. This distinction matters. Emergency creates speed. Crowding creates weight. The hospitals are beginning to feel heavy. Heavy with responsibility. Heavy with occupancy. Heavy with accumulated days of pressure. You watch evening settle across the wards. Lamps illuminate faces turned towards ceilings, windows, or sleep. Some patients write letters despite fatigue. Others simply listen to the sounds surrounding them. Nearby, nurses continue working with the same professionalism that defined earlier weeks. Yet the environment around them is different now. The empty spaces that once provided flexibility are steadily disappearing. And in institutions under pressure, flexibility often matters as much as resources themselves. Every occupied bed narrows future options. Every delayed transfer extends the strain. Every arrival reminds the staff that the siege remains unfinished. The hospitals still function remarkably well, but they are beginning to function without spare capacity. And that changes the meaning of every new patient who comes through the door. As the hospitals grow fuller, the meaning of waiting begins to change. Earlier in the siege, waiting had often implied expectation. A patient waited for treatment. A driver waited for instructions. A nurse waited for supplies scheduled to arrive. Waiting carried an assumption that movement would eventually follow. Now waiting increasingly becomes a condition of its own. Patients wait because transportation remains uncertain. Staff wait because information arrives slowly. Hospitals wait because relief, resupply, and evacuation exist somewhere beyond immediate reach. The distinction is subtle, yet it alters the atmosphere of entire buildings. You watch a recovery ward during the quiet hours between evening rounds and midnight. The lamps have been dimmed. Most conversations have faded into whispers. Snow presses softly against the windows. The room is crowded enough that nearly every occupied bed contributes its own rhythm of breathing, shifting blankets, and occasional restless movement. The ward feels less like a temporary stop along a journey and more like a destination in itself. Patients remain longer. Relationships deepen. Familiarity develops. The nurses begin recognizing not only names and injuries but personalities. One patient prefers reading whenever enough light is available. Another asks endless questions about events beyond the hospital walls. Someone else spends long periods staring through the windows, studying weather patterns as though they might reveal something about the future. The longer people remain together, the more these details matter. A hospital under siege becomes a small community whether it intends to or not. The nurses occupy the center of that community, not because they seek attention, because they connect everything. They move between rooms carrying information, supplies, reassurance, and practical assistance. They witness new arrivals and long recoveries. They encounter nearly everyone within the institution at some point during the day. As crowding increases, this connective role becomes even more important. You watch a nurse helping several patients write letters home. Some men are physically unable to hold a pen for long periods. Others struggle to organize their thoughts after days of exhaustion. The nurse assists where she can, recording brief messages intended for families far away. The letters rarely describe the full reality of the situation. Most focus upon reassurance. I am alive. I am recovering. Do not worry. Such phrases appear repeatedly. They offer comfort both to the families who will eventually receive them and to the patients who dictate them. Hope travels in many forms. Sometimes it arrives as medicine. Sometimes as food. Sometimes as a few sentences written carefully onto paper. The hospitals continue providing all three. Yet each act now occurs within a more crowded environment. The physical consequences become increasingly visible. Storage areas shrink as additional space is devoted to patients. Corridors serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Rooms designed for one function acquire another. Nothing feels chaotic. The adaptations are too deliberate for that. Instead, the buildings resemble ships carrying heavier loads than originally intended. Still seaworthy. Still moving. Simply carrying more weight. Outside Bastogne, the siege continues shaping events in ways that are only partially visible from inside the hospitals. Roads remain difficult. Communications remain imperfect. Military operations continue beyond forests and frozen fields. The nurses encounter these realities indirectly through human evidence. A newly admitted patient arrives after a longer journey than expected. A driver describes conditions encountered along a route. A physician mentions delays affecting transportation. Piece by piece, the broader situation reveals itself. Not through official briefings. Through consequences. The hospitals have become experts in reading consequences. Every institution develops a particular perspective based upon what passes through it. A railway station understands movement. A warehouse understands supply. A battlefield understands violence. A hospital understands aftermath. Everything arriving within Bastogne's wards has already happened somewhere else. Decisions have been made. Battles fought. Roads traveled. Weather endured. The hospitals receive the results. And the results are increasing. You watch nurses preparing for another night shift. Their movements remain practiced and efficient. They exchange information about patients. Review notes. Discuss concerns requiring observation before morning. The process is familiar. Yet fatigue is becoming more visible. Not dramatic fatigue. Not collapse. The quieter kind. The fatigue that accumulates across weeks. The fatigue of repeated interruptions. The fatigue of responsibility carried continuously. The fatigue of knowing that tomorrow will almost certainly resemble today. The nurses continue performing their duties with remarkable consistency. But consistency itself requires effort. Every routine maintained under pressure represents energy spent resisting disorder. As midnight approaches, the wards settle once more into uneasy rest. Beds remain occupied. Stretchers remain occupied. Nearly every available space serves a purpose. The hospitals have adapted successfully to crowding. That success carries its own warning. Adaptation often conceals how narrow the margins have become. A system functioning near capacity can still appear stable. Until something changes. And in Bastogne, change is arriving steadily through winter, through isolation, and through the relentless flow of casualties entering a town increasingly cut off from the wider world. The wards remain full. The lights remain burning. The nurses continue moving quietly through the night. And somewhere beyond the walls, the siege continues tightening around the roads that connect all of them to relief. The crowded rooms breathe together beneath dim light, while outside the snow keeps falling upon roads that seem farther away with each passing day. Nights measured in hours awake. Fatigue rarely arrives as a sudden event. It accumulates quietly, gathering strength through repetition. One shortened night of sleep can be recovered. 2 can be endured. A week becomes noticeable. Several weeks begin reshaping perception itself. Time feels different. Concentration behaves differently. The body continues functioning, yet everything requires slightly more effort than before. By this stage of the siege, the hospitals of Bastogne have entered that territory. The buildings remain active around the clock. Patients require observation at all hours. New arrivals appear regardless of darkness. Emergencies continue ignoring schedules. The routines that sustain the hospitals depend upon people remaining awake while much of the town sleeps. The nurses know this reality intimately. You watch one of them begin a night shift beneath a sky already dark by late afternoon. Winter has shortened the days until daylight feels almost temporary. The transition between afternoon and evening occurs quickly. Lamps illuminate corridors long before many people feel prepared for night. The nurse reviews reports from the previous shift. Temperatures. Medications. Concerns requiring attention. The information itself is familiar. The ritual surrounding it is familiar as well. Every shift begins this way. Every shift inherits responsibilities from the one before it. The continuity helps maintain order. It also obscures how long the work has been continuing. The siege encourages a peculiar relationship with time. Individual days remain identifiable, yet they gradually lose their distinct edges. One shift blends into another. One snowfall resembles the next. Yesterday's concerns remain present today. The hospitals continue moving forward. Yet many people inside them feel as though they are living within an extended present. Patients experience something similar. A wounded soldier recovering near a window watches another evening arrive. The view beyond the glass appears almost identical to the night before. Snow, darkness, occasional movement along the street. The repetition creates a sense of suspension. The war continues changing outside, yet inside the ward many days seem remarkably alike. For some patients, this consistency provides comfort. For others, restlessness. The nurses encounter both reactions. One patient wants conversation because silence leaves too much room for worry. Another prefers silence because conversation requires energy he no longer possesses. One asks repeatedly for updates about military developments. Another avoids the subject entirely. Fatigue influences these preferences more than people sometimes realize. Exhaustion narrows attention. The future becomes difficult to contemplate when the present already feels demanding. You watch the night shift settle into its rhythm. The corridors grow quieter. Administrative tasks diminish. Visitors become scarce. The hospitals remain busy, yet the nature of the work changes after dark. Observation becomes more important. Listening, monitoring, waiting. A nurse pauses beside a patient whose fever has fluctuated throughout the day. She checks his condition carefully, recording small changes that might seem insignificant to an outsider. A slight improvement. A slight decline. The body communicates through details. The nurses remain alert to those details despite their own growing weariness. This vigilance requires discipline. Fatigue encourages shortcuts. Professionalism resists them. The tension between the two becomes one of the defining challenges of prolonged medical work under siege conditions. Outside, winter reinforces the sense of isolation. Darkness covers the roads leading into and out of Bastogne. Snow reflects faint traces of moonlight where clouds permit. The forests surrounding the town appear motionless, their boundaries dissolving into shadow. The landscape feels distant from ordinary life. Inside the hospitals, however, ordinary life continues asserting itself in unexpected ways. Someone requests an extra blanket. Someone worries about family. Someone complains about the quality of soup. Someone laughs at a remark that would barely qualify as amusing under other circumstances. These moments matter because they resist the reduction of life into crisis alone. The nurses witness them constantly. A hospital is never composed entirely of suffering. Recovery exists there too. Humor, memory, routine. Human beings continue being themselves even under extraordinary pressure. Perhaps especially then. As midnight approaches, the pace slows without ever stopping. Patients sleep. Others remain awake. Nurses continue moving through the wards beneath dim light. Their footsteps become part of the building's nighttime atmosphere, as familiar as the creaking floors and the occasional hiss of heating systems working against the cold. The work continues. The hours continue. The fatigue continues. Yet so does the care. And in Bastogne, during these long winter nights, the persistence of care is becoming one of the most remarkable forms of endurance within the entire siege. The deepest hours of the night possess a character entirely their own. Even in crowded hospitals, there are moments when activity seems to recede into the background. Conversations fade. Footsteps become less frequent. Lamps illuminate only what is necessary. The building remains awake, yet it does so quietly. For the nurses, these hours often reveal the true extent of fatigue. Daylight carries momentum. Noise carries momentum. Constant movement can conceal exhaustion for surprisingly long periods. During the night, when the world slows, the body becomes more honest about its condition. A nurse sitting briefly at a desk to update records feels the weight of accumulated weeks settle into her shoulders. Another pauses beside a window and realizes she cannot immediately remember which day of the month it is. A third rereads a line of notes because concentration requires more effort than it once did. None of these moments indicate failure. They indicate humanity. The hospitals continue functioning because the people within them remain remarkably disciplined despite their limitations, not because those limitations have disappeared. You watch one ward shortly after 2 in the morning. Most of the patients are asleep. A few remain awake beneath blankets, listening to the sounds of the building. Somewhere in the distance, a door closes softly. Water runs through pipes. Wind brushes against the walls. The nurse on duty moves from bed to bed carrying a shaded lamp. The light travels slowly through the darkness. She checks temperatures, adjusts blankets, offers water, records observations. The routine appears simple. Its simplicity is deceptive. Every action requires attention. Every observation requires judgment. Every decision carries consequences, however small. Fatigue does not remove these responsibilities. It merely makes them more difficult. The nurses learn to compensate. Habits become safeguards. Procedures become anchors. Routine protects accuracy when energy begins to diminish. This is one reason hospitals rely so heavily upon repetition. The same sequence followed consistently reduces the likelihood of mistakes. Under siege conditions, such consistency becomes even more valuable. The institution itself begins supporting the people sustaining it. You watch a surgeon emerge from a treatment room after hours of work. His movements remain steady, yet the signs of exhaustion are visible. He pauses briefly in the corridor before continuing onward. Similar scenes occur throughout the hospital. The fatigue is collective now. Not identical for everyone. Shared. The distinction matters. A tired individual can feel isolated. A tired community develops understanding. People recognize the strain in one another because they are experiencing versions of it themselves. The nurses exchange small acts of support almost without thinking. A cup of coffee prepared for someone nearing the end of a shift. Assistance offered with a difficult task. A few minutes of relief granted when possible. Such gestures rarely appear in official records. Yet they help sustain institutions through difficult periods. Endurance is often communal before it is individual. Outside Bastogne, the winter night continues stretching across forests and frozen roads. Vehicles move cautiously where movement remains possible. Soldiers endure the cold in positions scattered across the countryside. The siege affects thousands of people experiencing it in different ways. Inside the hospitals, however, the night reduces everything to more immediate realities. The next patient. The next hour. The next round of observations. The next decision. You watch a nurse speak quietly with a patient unable to sleep. Pain explains part of his wakefulness. Anxiety explains the rest. The conversation remains gentle and practical. No grand promises are offered. No certainty is invented. Sometimes reassurance consists simply of presence. The nurse remains for a few minutes before continuing her rounds. The patient closes his eyes. The ward returns to relative silence. Moments like this occur repeatedly throughout the night. Most leave no documentation. No report records them. No statistic measures them. Yet they shape the experience of both caregivers and patients. The siege is creating shortages of many things. It has not yet created a shortage of compassion. As the hours pass, dawn begins its slow approach. The change is initially imperceptible. Darkness remains dominant. The snow-covered world beyond the windows still appears asleep. Yet the nurses recognize the signs. A slightly different quality of light. A subtle shift in atmosphere. Another night successfully carried across the threshold into morning. The achievement feels modest. It is not. Every completed shift represents endurance made visible. Every night survived without collapse represents resilience. The hospitals continue functioning not because fatigue is absent, but because fatigue has been absorbed into routine and managed through discipline, cooperation, and experience. Still, fatigue continues accumulating. The nurses know it. The surgeons know it. The patients see it. And as the siege continues, the challenge will no longer be simply remaining awake through another night. It will be preserving strength for all the nights still to come. Beyond the windows, the first traces of morning touch the snow, while inside the hospitals another shift prepares to begin before the previous one has fully rested. Emergency becoming routine. There is a moment during prolonged crises when the extraordinary begins to feel familiar. The transformation rarely occurs because circumstances improve. More often, it occurs because human beings adapt. Conditions that once seemed temporary become incorporated into daily life. People stop asking when normality will return and begin organizing themselves around the reality that exists. The hospitals of Bastogne are approaching that threshold. The siege continues. The shortages remain. The crowding persists. The fatigue deepens. Yet the staff continue performing their duties with such consistency that activities once associated with emergency now feel almost ordinary. This adaptation is both impressive and unsettling. You watch a nurse begin another morning shift. Outside, winter remains unchanged. Snow still covers rooftops and roads. The cold still dominates the landscape. Inside, the ward she enters remains crowded with recovering patients, newly arrived casualties, and those waiting for transportation that may or may not become available soon. Several weeks earlier, such conditions would have seemed exceptional. Now they are simply the environment. The nurse reviews her assignments and begins moving through familiar routines. Temperatures are recorded. Dressings are inspected. Medications are distributed. Questions are answered. The work proceeds smoothly because everyone involved has learned how to function within constraints that once felt temporary. The hospitals are no longer adapting to the siege. They are operating inside it. The distinction matters. Adaptation implies transition. Operation implies permanence. For the moment, at least, the siege has become the normal condition against which everything else is measured. You watch an orderly carrying supplies through a corridor lined with stretchers. He moves confidently around obstacles that might have seemed inconvenient earlier in the winter. The route has become familiar. The crowding has become familiar. The constant movement of patients and staff has become familiar. The environment has taught everyone how to navigate it. This process unfolds throughout the hospitals. Nurses become skilled at identifying which concerns require immediate attention and which can safely wait. Surgeons learn how to allocate limited time and resources with increasing efficiency. Administrators develop expectations based not upon ideal circumstances but upon the conditions actually present. The institution reorganizes itself around reality. Such reorganization is one of the quiet achievements of endurance. People often imagine resilience as stubborn resistance. In practice, resilience frequently resembles flexibility. The hospitals survive not because they refuse to change, but because they continue changing in response to pressure. Yet adaptation carries risks. When emergency becomes routine, certain warning signs lose their ability to attract attention. Crowded wards begin looking normal. Exhausted staff begin looking normal. Delays begin looking normal. The very success of adaptation can conceal how difficult circumstances have become. You watch a nurse helping prepare a patient for surgery. The process unfolds with calm professionalism. Equipment is arranged. Records are reviewed. Instructions are given. Nothing about the scene suggests crisis. Yet nearly every element involved reflects weeks of adjustment. The room is being used more heavily than intended. The staff have worked longer hours than planned. The supplies have been managed more carefully than usual. The operation proceeds successfully because adaptation has occurred, not because pressure is absent. This distinction remains important. Throughout Bastogne, many systems continue functioning despite increasing strain. Observers encountering only the outcome might underestimate the effort required to achieve it. The hospitals are among those systems. Patients still receive care. Therefore, the hospitals appear successful. The conclusion is correct. It is also incomplete. Success now demands significantly more effort than before. Outside, winter continues imposing its own form of repetition. Day follows night. Snow follows snow. The forests remain motionless beneath pale skies. The landscape seems trapped within a season that refuses to advance. Inside the hospitals, a similar repetition has emerged. Admissions, treatment, recovery, observation, another admission, another treatment, another recovery. The cycle continues. The nurses move through it with remarkable steadiness. You watch one pause briefly beside a window overlooking the town. The view has changed little in recent days. Snow-covered roofs, smoke rising from chimneys, vehicles moving cautiously through icy streets. The familiarity of the scene feels almost deceptive. Because beneath that familiarity, pressure continues accumulating. The hospitals have learned how to live inside the emergency. The emergency itself has not disappeared. And that reality will become increasingly important as the siege approaches its final phase. The routines that emerge during a siege possess a curious dual nature. On one hand, they provide stability. Familiar actions reduce uncertainty. Repetition creates structure where circumstances offer little else. A nurse beginning her shift knows where to go, what to check, and which responsibilities await her. That knowledge carries comfort. On the other hand, routine can disguise accumulation. A burden lifted once feels heavy. A burden lifted daily begins to feel ordinary. The weight has not diminished. The perception of it has changed. The hospitals of Bastogne are living inside that paradox. You watch a ward during the middle of the afternoon. The atmosphere feels almost calm. Patients read, write letters, or rest beneath blankets. Nurses move steadily between beds. Conversations occur in low voices. The scene lacks any obvious signs of crisis. Yet nearly every person present is carrying more strain than they were weeks earlier. The calm has become practiced. The endurance has become habitual. The emergency has become routine. This transformation influences patients as much as staff. A soldier recovering from injuries received before Christmas now measures time differently. The days no longer feel distinct. Meals, medical checks, and changes of shift provide the primary markers separating one day from the next. News from outside arrives intermittently. Weather remains largely unchanged. The world has narrowed. Many patients experience similar contractions of perspective. The future becomes difficult to imagine clearly. The past begins feeling distant. Attention settles upon immediate realities. Today's treatment. Today's weather. Today's conversation. The nurses witness this process repeatedly. Some patients become quieter. Others become more talkative. Many develop habits that help organize otherwise repetitive days. Reading when possible. Writing letters. Following routines that create a sense of continuity. Human beings naturally seek structure. The siege provides little. The hospitals provide what they can. You watch a nurse distributing mail that has finally reached the ward after delays. The effect is immediate. Faces brighten. Conversations begin. A few pages of paper suddenly carry immense significance. Letters function as bridges. They connect the crowded wards of Bastogne to homes scattered across continents. They remind patients that life continues beyond the siege. Families continue living ordinary days. Children continue attending school. Farms continue operating. Factories continue working. The reminders matter. Isolation affects perception. Connection restores proportion. The nurses understand this instinctively. They have spent weeks watching how small pieces of normality influence recovery. A letter. A newspaper. A familiar story. Such things cannot heal wounds directly, yet they strengthen something equally important. The sense that life extends beyond the present hardship. Outside the hospitals, the military situation continues evolving. Relief efforts move closer. Roads remain contested and difficult. Reports grow increasingly hopeful, though certainty remains elusive. Inside the wards, these developments arrive slowly, not as dramatic announcements, as changing atmosphere. Conversations carry slightly different tones. Rumors feel less pessimistic. Questions about the future become more common. The hospitals are still operating under siege conditions, yet people have begun imagining what comes afterward. This shift is subtle but meaningful. Hope behaves differently from confidence. Confidence expects. Hope wonders. Many within Bastogne possess hope before they possess certainty. The nurses occupy an unusual position in relation to that hope. Their responsibilities require realism. They cannot promise outcomes they do not control. Yet they also understand the value of encouraging recovery, patience, and endurance. The balance requires skill. You watch a nurse speaking with a patient frustrated by slow progress. His wounds are healing, but not as quickly as he would like. The conversation remains practical. Improvement is acknowledged. Limitations are acknowledged. No false optimism is offered. Yet the patient leaves the exchange calmer than before. Such interactions occur constantly. The nurses have become custodians of perspective as much as medicine. As evening approaches once again, the hospitals settle into familiar rhythms. The same corridors. The same wards. The same winter light fading beyond the windows. Everything appears remarkably similar to previous days. Yet beneath the surface, change is occurring. The staff have endured weeks of pressure. The patients have endured weeks of uncertainty. The institutions have endured weeks of constraint. None of them are exactly the same as they were when the siege began. Adaptation has altered them. Fatigue has altered them. Experience has altered them. The hospitals continue functioning because thousands of small adjustments have accumulated over time. And now, as signs of eventual relief begin filtering through the town, another transformation is slowly approaching. The challenge will no longer be learning how to live within the siege. The challenge will become understanding what remains after the siege begins to loosen its grip. The afternoon light fades across crowded wards where routine has made endurance possible, while beyond the town the first hints of change move slowly through the winter landscape. Roads opening again. At first, the change feels more like a rumor than a reality. The hospitals of Bastogne have spent so long adapting to uncertainty that certainty itself seems unfamiliar. Reports arrive describing advances, reopened routes, and improving conditions beyond the town. The information spreads through conversations in corridors, treatment rooms, kitchens, and wards. People listen carefully. They have learned caution. Too many reports throughout the siege proved incomplete or premature. Hope remains present, but it remains disciplined. The nurses continue working exactly as before. Patients continue receiving treatment. The wards remain crowded. Nothing inside the hospitals changes immediately. Yet the atmosphere begins to shift. You watch a nurse making morning rounds beneath a pale winter sky. Snow still covers the landscape beyond the windows. The buildings remain full. Supplies remain precious. Fatigue remains visible in faces throughout the institution. The siege has not vanished overnight. But something has changed. The future has reappeared. For weeks, daily life revolved around preservation. The hospitals focused upon maintaining function under pressure. Looking too far ahead often felt impractical because conditions changed constantly. Now conversations begin extending beyond the next shift, the next meal, or the next day. Questions emerge. When might transfers resume more regularly? When might supplies arrive without delay? When might patients continue journeys interrupted by the siege? The questions themselves reveal transformation. People ask them because they can imagine answers. Outside Bastogne, roads that had seemed unreliable begin slowly returning to usefulness. Movement remains difficult. Winter has not surrendered its influence. Snow and ice still shape travel. Yet the sense of complete isolation begins weakening. The hospitals experience this change through evidence rather than announcements. A shipment arrives. Then another. Transportation appears slightly more predictable. Information travels with greater consistency. Each development seems modest. Together they carry profound significance. The circulation upon which the medical system depends is beginning to recover. You watch supplies being unloaded into storage areas that have spent weeks operating beneath uncertainty. The quantities involved matter. Equally important is what they represent. Connection. The hospitals are no longer relying solely upon what already exists within Bastogne. The wider network supporting them is gradually becoming visible once more. The staff notice immediately. Not because abundance suddenly returns. Because the calculations change. During the height of the siege, every resource inspired questions about endurance. How long will it last? How carefully must it be conserved? What alternatives exist if it runs out? Now a different possibility enters the equation. Replacement, replenishment, continuation. The arithmetic of scarcity does not disappear, but it becomes less dominant. The nurses continue counting supplies. They simply do so with slightly less apprehension. Patients sense the shift as well. A recovering soldier hears that transportation may soon become available for certain cases. Another learns that mail service is improving. Someone else receives news delayed for weeks by weather and combat. None of these developments ends the hardships already endured. Yet they alter perception. Hope acquires substance. You watch a ward during the middle of the afternoon. The room remains crowded. Beds remain occupied. Stretchers remain positioned wherever space allows. At first glance, little appears different from previous chapters of the siege. The difference exists beneath the surface. People speak about future events rather than merely enduring present circumstances. A patient wonders when he might leave. A nurse discusses expected deliveries. An administrator reviews plans that would have seemed unrealistic only days earlier. The hospitals are beginning to transition from survival toward recovery. Transitions of this kind are rarely immediate. Institutions do not simply switch from one condition to another. They carry traces of previous pressures forward with them. Fatigue remains. Shortages leave consequences. Crowded wards remain crowded. Yet movement itself changes the emotional landscape. For weeks, the hospitals adapted to a world growing narrower. Now that world is slowly widening again. Outside, winter sunlight touches the snow-covered roads surrounding Bastogne. Vehicles move where movement had previously seemed uncertain. The countryside remains scarred by conflict, yet it no longer feels completely closed. Inside the hospitals, the nurses continue working with the same professionalism that sustained the siege. The tasks remain familiar. The environment remains demanding. But for the first time in many days, the routines unfolding within the wards are no longer devoted solely to endurance. They are beginning to make room for expectation. Relief arrives unevenly. History often remembers it as a moment. A road opens. A force arrives. A siege ends. Such descriptions are useful for maps and timelines, yet they rarely capture how change is experienced by the people living inside it. For the hospitals of Bastogne, relief unfolds gradually. The buildings do not become less crowded overnight. The nurses do not suddenly become rested. The patients do not instantly recover. Instead, the pressure that has defined daily life for weeks begins loosening in small increments. One transfer becomes possible. Then another. A shipment arrives with fewer complications than before. Communication improves. The changes accumulate just as the hardships accumulated. One piece at a time. You watch a nurse helping prepare several patients for transport. Similar preparations occurred before the siege, but they now carry a different significance. During the weeks of isolation, movement often felt uncertain. Now movement has returned as a realistic expectation. The process remains practical. Records are reviewed. Dressings are checked. Instructions are exchanged. Yet beneath these ordinary actions runs a current of quiet satisfaction. A patient leaving a crowded ward creates space. A patient continuing recovery elsewhere represents progress. The medical system is beginning to circulate once more. The nurses understand the importance immediately because they have spent weeks experiencing the consequences of stagnation. Hospitals are designed around movement. Patients arrive. Patients are treated. Patients continue onward. When that cycle slows, pressure accumulates. When it resumes, pressure gradually begins to ease. You watch a corridor that had seemed perpetually crowded throughout much of the siege. It remains busy. Stretchers still line portions of the walls. Staff members still move constantly between rooms. Yet there are moments now when the building seems capable of breathing again. A little more space. A little more flexibility. A little less compression. The differences are modest. They matter enormously. Patients experience relief through anticipation. Some speak openly about future plans. Others remain cautious, reluctant to trust circumstances that have changed so often. Many simply enjoy the possibility of imagining a future beyond the hospital walls. The nurses witness every variation. One patient talks endlessly about returning home. Another worries about what recovery will require. Someone else remains focused entirely upon the next stage of treatment. The future re-enters the conversation in many forms. During the height of the siege, attention narrowed toward immediate survival. The next meal. The next shift. The next delivery. Such focus was necessary. Now perspective begins expanding again. The hospitals remain places of treatment, but they are gradually becoming places of transition once more. You watch evening settle across Bastogne. Snow still covers the town. Chimneys release smoke into the cold air. The forests surrounding the roads remain dark and silent beneath winter skies. Much of the landscape appears unchanged. Yet change is visible in movement. Vehicles arrive more regularly. Information travels more freely. People begin planning rather than merely enduring. The nurses continue carrying fatigue accumulated across weeks of strain. Relief does not erase exhaustion. In some ways, it reveals it. When constant pressure eases slightly, the body becomes more aware of what it has been carrying. A nurse finishing her shift notices how tired she truly feels. A surgeon discovers that a brief period of quiet feels unfamiliar. An orderly realizes he can remember little about certain days because they merge together beneath relentless routine. These recognitions emerge naturally. Endurance often postpones reflection. Reflection arrives when survival no longer occupies every available space. The hospitals are entering that phase. Not fully. Not yet. But increasingly. You watch one ward during the final hours before nightfall. Several beds that stood occupied for weeks are now empty. Not many. A few. The sight attracts attention precisely because emptiness has become unusual. An empty bed now symbolizes movement, recovery, possibility. The siege has taught everyone inside the hospitals to notice such details. The nurses continue their rounds as they always have. Temperatures are checked. Medicines distributed. Questions answered. The work remains constant. Yet the atmosphere surrounding the work has changed. The hospitals are no longer fighting merely to preserve function. They are beginning to restore it. And restoration carries its own emotional weight. Because after weeks spent measuring resources, managing crowding, and enduring fatigue, the return of ordinary expectations can feel almost extraordinary. Outside, winter continues holding the countryside in its cold embrace. Inside, the hospitals begin rediscovering rhythms that existed before the siege. Not all at once. Not completely. But enough to remind everyone that hardship, however consuming, is never meant to become permanent. The first empty beds stand quietly beneath the ward lights, while beyond the windows the reopened roads stretch once more into the winter distance. The weight that remains. The end of a siege does not erase the experience of living through it. Roads may reopen. Supplies may arrive. Patients may continue their journeys. Yet the people who endured the pressure carry evidence of it long afterward. Not always in dramatic ways. More often through quieter changes that reveal themselves gradually. The hospitals of Bastogne discover this as recovery begins replacing survival as the dominant condition. At first, the transition seems straightforward. Crowding eases. Transportation improves. Communication becomes more reliable. The medical system begins functioning with greater flexibility. Yet beneath these improvements lies another reality. The staff are exhausted. Not merely tired. Exhausted in the way people become after sustaining responsibility for longer than they believed possible. You watch a nurse completing a shift that resembles many others she has worked during the winter. The tasks remain familiar. The corridors remain recognizable. The patients still require care. Yet something feels different. The urgency has diminished just enough to allow awareness. During the siege, there was always another task waiting. Another patient. Another decision. Another practical concern demanding attention. Reflection often felt like a luxury. Now moments of stillness are returning. And stillness invites memory. The nurses begin recalling details that seemed insignificant at the time. Particular patients. Particular nights. Particular conversations. A snowstorm endured. A shipment delayed. A moment when supplies seemed unlikely to last. The memories surface unexpectedly. One observation leads to another. The mind begins assembling experiences that had previously been stored only as fragments. You watch a ward during a quiet afternoon. Several beds have been emptied through transfer or recovery. Light filters through the windows, reflecting from snow still covering the town. The atmosphere feels calmer than it has in many weeks. Patients notice it. Staff notice it. The building itself seems different. Yet the quieter environment reveals something else. Absence. People who occupied certain beds are no longer present. Some recovered. Some moved elsewhere. Some did not survive. Hospitals become deeply familiar with absence because they witness constant change in occupancy. During the siege, there was rarely time to contemplate these departures. New responsibilities arrived too quickly. Now, with pressure easing, memory begins filling spaces that routine once occupied. The nurses experience this more intensely than many others. They spent weeks moving continuously between patients. They learned names, heard stories, observed recoveries, witnessed setbacks. Relationships formed within the practical boundaries of medical care. When those relationships end, even naturally, traces remain. A particular voice remembered. A particular habit. A letter dictated home. A joke repeated too often. The details seem small. Human connection often resides in small details. Outside Bastogne, the wider world continues moving forward. Military operations continue. Armies reposition. Roads carry traffic once again. The conflict itself has not ended. Inside the hospitals, however, a different process is unfolding. Assessment. Not official assessment. Human assessment. People are beginning to understand what they have experienced. You watch a nurse pausing beside a window during a rare quiet moment. The snow-covered landscape beyond appears peaceful. Vehicles move along roads that recently seemed uncertain. Smoke rises from chimneys into pale winter air. The scene feels almost ordinary. Perhaps that is what makes it remarkable. Ordinary life has returned sufficiently that it can be recognized. During the siege, ordinary life often seemed distant. Now it stands visible once more. Yet the return of normality does not immediately restore those who endured the disruption. Recovery applies to institutions as well as patients. The hospitals remain functional. They also remain marked by the experience. Every adaptation developed during the siege tells part of the story. Every crowded ward, every conserved resource, every extra shift worked through exhaustion. The evidence exists throughout the buildings, and within the people who kept them operating. The nurses continue their duties as they always have. But increasingly, those duties occur alongside reflection. The siege is ending. Its memory is beginning. Memory rarely arrives in chronological order. It does not organize itself according to reports, schedules, or official timelines. Instead, it moves through association. A particular smell recalls a specific night. A familiar face evokes an entire season. A corridor walked hundreds of times suddenly becomes connected to a moment long forgotten. As pressure eases within Bastogne's hospitals, such memories begin surfacing everywhere. The nurses continue working. Patients continue recovering. Supplies continue arriving with greater reliability than before. Outwardly, the institutions appear focused upon the future. Yet beneath daily routines, many people are quietly revisiting the past. You watch a nurse passing through a treatment room now operating under less strain than during the height of the siege. The room appears almost unchanged. The same tables. The same instruments. The same windows overlooking the winter landscape. Yet she remembers the room differently. She remembers it crowded, cold, busy, filled with urgency. The present and the past occupy the same physical space. Only the pressure has changed. Throughout the hospitals, similar acts of recollection unfold. An orderly remembers nights when every available stretcher seemed occupied. A surgeon recalls decisions made under uncertainty. A patient recovering near discharge remembers arriving exhausted after a difficult journey through snow and confusion. Memory transforms ordinary environments into archives. The hospitals become filled with invisible histories visible only to those who experienced them. You watch several nurses sharing a brief conversation during a quieter portion of the day. The subject begins with practical matters before drifting toward recent weeks. Someone mentions a storm. Someone else recalls a supply shortage. A third remembers a patient whose determination became a source of inspiration for an entire ward. The stories emerge naturally. Not because anyone intends to preserve history, because human beings process experience through storytelling. The siege is already becoming narrative. Not distant narrative. Living narrative. The kind still close enough to carry emotional weight. Outside Bastogne, winter remains present though its grip seems less absolute than before. Roads remain challenging, yet they no longer feel permanently uncertain. Vehicles travel routes that recently appeared fragile. The landscape itself seems to exhale. The hospitals mirror that process. The buildings are not relaxing exactly. Hospitals rarely relax. Rather, they are rediscovering proportions. A crowded ward becomes manageable. A shortage becomes temporary. A delay becomes inconvenience rather than threat. The difference lies not in the absence of problems but in the return of options. Options change everything. During the siege, many decisions were shaped by limitation. Staff worked within narrow margins because narrow margins were all that existed. Now those margins begin widening again. The nurses feel the change immediately. They can plan more confidently, allocate resources more comfortably, look beyond immediate necessity. The return of flexibility feels almost luxurious after weeks spent operating without it. Yet reflection continues alongside recovery. You watch a patient preparing to leave the hospital after an extended stay. His belongings occupy surprisingly little space. A few personal items, letters, clothing, small reminders of a life interrupted by injury and war. The nurses assisting him understand that departure carries multiple meanings. Medical progress, personal progress, a return to movement after a long period of waiting. Such departures occur with increasing frequency. Each one lightens the burden upon the institution. Each one also marks the conclusion of a relationship formed under unusual circumstances. Hospitals are transient communities by nature. People arrive, share space briefly, then continue elsewhere. During the siege, however, those communities persisted longer than expected. Familiarity deepened. Shared hardship accelerated connection. The nurses experienced this repeatedly. Now they experience its counterpart. Parting. Most departures are positive. Some remain bittersweet. All remind the staff that the siege is truly ending. As evening approaches, light fades across the wards once more. Winter continues following its familiar rhythms. Snow reflects the final traces of daylight. Shadows lengthen across floors that have carried countless footsteps over recent weeks. The hospitals remain active. The work remains unfinished. Yet the atmosphere has changed fundamentally. The defining challenge is no longer survival under isolation. It is understanding what the period of isolation meant. The nurses, perhaps more than anyone else within Bastogne, occupy a unique position in that process. They witnessed nearly every stage. The arrivals, the shortages, the crowding, the fatigue, the gradual return of connection. Through hundreds of ordinary acts of care, they became quiet observers of an extraordinary period. Now, as the siege recedes into memory, they begin carrying those observations forward. Not as heroes seeking recognition. Not as historians seeking documentation. Simply as people who were present. And presence itself leaves marks that endure long after circumstances have changed. The evening settles gently over wards growing less crowded, while memory lingers in the spaces where pressure once lived. Aftermath. Years later, visitors would arrive in Bastogne and find roads instead of isolation. They would see vehicles moving freely through intersections that once carried extraordinary significance. They would walk past buildings that had returned to ordinary purposes. They would encounter a town that continued living, growing, repairing, and remembering. The snow, when it came each winter, would still settle upon rooftops and forests much as it had during 1944. The trees would still stand along the roads. The fields would still disappear beneath white blankets. To an unfamiliar observer, the landscape might appear unchanged. Yet landscapes remember in quiet ways. So do institutions. And so do people. The nurses who worked inside Bastogne's hospitals carried the siege forward long after it ended. Not necessarily through dramatic recollections or public recognition. More often through memory's smaller pathways. A particular winter morning recalled unexpectedly. A familiar smell bringing back an entire ward. The memory of moving through dark corridors while snow gathered outside the windows. Many would continue nursing after the war. Others would follow different paths. Life, as it always does, would move onward. Yet certain experiences resist being left entirely behind. Not because they were extraordinary in the conventional sense. Because they were sustained. Day after day. Night after night. The siege asked for endurance rather than spectacle. And endurance leaves its own kind of imprint. Throughout this journey, we have spent little time upon battle maps. We have followed few generals. We have not lingered upon strategy for long. Those stories matter, and they remain part of Bastogne's history. But history often remembers movement while overlooking maintenance. It remembers breakthroughs while forgetting preservation. It remembers those who changed events while sometimes overlooking those who sustained lives long enough to witness those changes. The nurses belonged to that second category. While roads closed, they continued working. While supplies grew uncertain, they continued working. While wards became crowded and fatigue deepened and winter tightened around the town, they continued working. Not because they believed themselves exceptional. Because the next patient required care. And then the next. And then the next. The simplicity of that commitment remains one of the most remarkable aspects of the story. You can almost picture the hospitals now in the quiet distance of memory. The lamps glowing against winter darkness. The soft sounds of occupied wards. The footsteps of nurses moving steadily through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly across long nights. Outside, snow drifting across roads whose importance few could have fully understood at the time. Inside, people preserving life with whatever resources remained available. The image feels distant now. Yet it also feels familiar. Perhaps because every generation eventually discovers its own versions of endurance. Different circumstances. Different pressures. Different landscapes. Yet the same quiet determination appearing whenever ordinary people choose to continue caring for one another despite uncertainty. That may be one of the enduring lessons hidden within Bastogne. The siege eventually ended. The shortages eased. The roads reopened. The winter passed. Yet what remains most visible is not the pressure itself. It is the persistence that survived it. And so the snow continues falling across memory. The roads continue stretching through the forests. The hospitals continue existing in photographs, records, and recollections. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between history's larger events, the nurses of Bastogne continue their rounds beneath dim lights, moving patiently through crowded wards where care remained possible even during the hardest days of winter. The wind moves softly through the trees beyond the town now, just as it did then. It carries no reports, no orders, no urgency, only motion, only time. Only the reminder that even the longest winters eventually loosen their grip. And when they do, what often matters most is not who stood at the center of events, but who remained present through every ordinary hour surrounding them. You've been part of Echoes of War, where stories rise on quiet wings, and the past still circles above us, refusing to land.